Stand in the Tenere Desert today, and you'll find hippo bones scattered across dunes. Harpoons carved for spearing fish lie half buried in places where rain hasn't fallen in years. Walk carefully, and you'll hear shells crunching underfoot. Millions of bleached mollusks carpeting ground that hasn't seen water in 5,000 years. These aren't anomalies. Archaeological teams working in Niger, Mali, and southern Libya have cataloged hundreds of sites where the material evidence contradicts the landscape's indications. Pottery shards decorated with wavy lines, a style associated with fishing cultures, turn up in regions where the nearest permanent water is 300 miles away. Rock art preserved in canyon overhangs depicts people swimming horizontally, with their bodies parallel to the ground, in what can only be interpreted as depictions of deep water. The paintings sit on cliff faces that now overlook nothing but sand and stone. The bones tell the most unambiguous story. Elephant remains have been excavated from the heart of the Tenere, alongside gazelles, giraffes, and aurochs, the wild cattle that required grassland to survive. But the presence of hippos is the definitive proof. Hippos are obligate aquatic mammals. They cannot survive without year-round access to water deep enough to submerge their bodies. Finding their fossils in what is now the driest region of the Sahara is the equivalent of finding whale skeletons in the middle of Kansas. The Sahara we know, 3.5 million square miles of sand baking under relentless sun, is the exception, not the rule. For most of human prehistory in North Africa, the desert didn't exist. In its place stood a vast expanse of lakes, rivers, and grasslands that connected the Mediterranean coast to sub-Saharan Africa in one continuous green corridor. This era is called the African Humid Period, and understanding why it happened and why it ended requires looking up at Earth's orbital mechanics and down at the physics of sand and vegetation. 9,000 years ago, a body of water covered 400,000 square kilometers of what is now the Central Sahara. Lake Megachad stretched across territory larger than the Caspian Sea, larger than all 5 North American Great Lakes combined. In places, it reached depths of nearly 600 feet. Rivers fed into it from hundreds of miles away, carrying runoff from highlands that today see less than an inch of rain per year. The lake supported Nile perch that grew to 6 feet long and weighed over 200 pounds. Hippos wallowed in shallows that extended for miles. Crocodiles, specifically the West African crocodile, hunted along shorelines that are now marked only by compressed layers of shells visible in cliff faces where wind has scoured away the sand. The lake's modern remnant, Lake Chad, fluctuates around 500 to 1,000 square miles depending on seasonal rains. The ratio between past and present is almost incomprehensible. This wasn't an isolated phenomenon. The entire Sahara held water. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have mapped ancient river channels, crisscrossing regions that are now absolute wasteland. Dry valleys, wadis, cut through rock and drainage patterns that could only form under sustained rainfall. The Tenere Desert, among the driest places on Earth, was a network of streams connecting scattered lakes. The question isn't whether this happened. Sediment cores drilled from the floors of these vanished lakes show continuous deposition of organic material, pollen, algae, microscopic shells, for thousands of years. The question is how? How does 3.5 million square miles of desert simply disappear? And how does it come back? Earth spins on a tilted axis, and that axis wobbles. The wobble follows a cycle lasting approximately 23,000 years, shifting which hemisphere points toward the sun when Earth reaches perihelion, its closest approach to the sun during its annual orbit. This is precession, one of the Milankovitch cycles that govern long-term climate patterns. 10,000 years ago, the northern hemisphere was tilted toward the sun at perihelion. The timing delivered roughly 7 to 8% more solar radiation to the northern hemisphere during summer than it receives today. That figure might sound modest, but climate systems operate on thresholds. Small changes in energy input can trigger disproportionate responses when they push a system past a tipping point. The Sahara absorbed that extra radiation. Land heats faster than water, a basic principle of thermodynamics. By midsummer, the North African landmass was superheated compared to the surrounding Atlantic Ocean. Hot air rises. As the scorching air over the Sahara ascended, it created a zone of low atmospheric pressure at the surface. Pressure differentials drive wind. Air moves from high pressure zones toward low pressure zones to equalize the imbalance. In this case, cool, moisture-laden air sitting over the Atlantic Ocean began flowing eastward and inland, pulled by the vacuum forming over the baking desert. This is the basic engine of a monsoon system, a seasonal wind reversal driven by differential heating between land and ocean. Today, the African monsoon penetrates only to the southern edges of the Sahara, dumping rain across the Sahel before the system weakens. 10,000 years ago, the monsoon was stronger. The low-pressure pump over the Sahara was powerful enough to pull Atlantic moisture thousands of miles inland, far beyond where rain reaches in the modern climate. Regions that now receive 1 to 4 inches of rain annually were suddenly receiving 20 to 40 inches, comparable to the rainfall in parts of England or the American Midwest. But orbital forcing alone doesn't explain the full transformation. Precession provided the initial push, but the Sahara's response was amplified by feedback mechanisms embedded in the land itself. Moisture-laden air flowing off the Atlantic met the superheated Sahara and began to rise. As air rises, it cools. Cool air holds less moisture than warm air, so the water vapor condensed and fell as rain. The first rains would have been scattered, inconsistent, seasonal storms that soaked small patches of ground before evaporating in the heat. But rain changes the surface. Seeds dormant in the soil sprouted. Vegetation began to spread. First grasses, then shrubs, eventually acacia and hackberry trees, dotting the landscape in open savanna woodlands. Water pooled in low-lying basins, forming shallow lakes that grew with each wet season. Rivers that had been dry for thousands of years began to flow again, carving channels through sediment. Each of these changes altered the land's physical properties in ways that fed back into the climate system. The most critical factor was albedo, the measure of how much sunlight a surface reflects. Light-colored surfaces have high albedo. They reflect solar radiation back into space. Dark surfaces have low albedo. They absorb solar radiation and convert it into heat. Sand is light-colored. Bare desert reflects a significant portion of incoming sunlight, which limits how much the surface heats up. Vegetation is dark. Plants, especially when wet, absorb sunlight rather than reflecting it. As the Sahara greened, its albedo dropped. The darker surface absorbed more solar energy, heating the ground more intensely than bare sand ever could. Hotter ground means hotter air rising off the surface. Hotter air rising means stronger low pressure at ground level. Stronger low pressure means a more powerful draw pulling Atlantic moisture inland. More moisture means more rain. More rain means more vegetation. This is a positive feedback loop. The system reinforces itself. Small increases in rainfall produce vegetation, which amplifies the heating, which intensifies the monsoon, which delivers more rain. The loop doesn't require continuous external forcing to keep running. It becomes self-sustaining once triggered. The orbital boost from precession started the process, but the feedback loop drove the Sahara from scattered wet patches to a fully greened landscape in a geologically brief span of time. The same feedback operated in reverse. Vegetation isn't just a passive recipient of rainfall, it actively participates in the water cycle. Plants transpire, releasing moisture into the air through their leaves. This adds humidity to the local atmosphere, which increases the likelihood of rain forming even without additional moisture being pulled in from the ocean. A densely vegetated Sahara was essentially generating some of its own rainfall through transpiration, creating a regional climate that was wetter than the orbital forcing alone would predict. The system had two stable states, green and wet, or brown and dry. The transition between them was not gradual. Once the feedback loop engaged, the transformation accelerated until the entire system locked into the new configuration. The Sahara didn't slowly fade from desert to grassland, it flipped. The greening didn't stop at grasslands. As rainfall increased and stabilized, ecosystems became more complex. Lake Megachad expanded to its maximum extent around 9,000 years ago, fed by rivers draining from highlands across a region spanning modern Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. The lake was deep enough and large enough to support its own localized weather patterns. Evaporation from the surface added moisture to the air, which fell as rain over the surrounding land, which drained back into the lake. Tropical gallery forests formed along the shores of the megalakes and the banks of permanent rivers. These weren't the dense rainforests of equatorial Africa, but ribbons of closed canopy woodland dominated by species that required year-round water. The presence of forest pollen and sediment cores from the central Sahara indicates that trees extended far beyond the lake margins, following river valleys deep into regions that are now barren rock. Open savannas stretched between the forested corridors, dominated by grasses and scattered acacia trees. This was the landscape that supported megafauna. Elephants roamed herds across the grasslands, feeding on the abundant vegetation. Giraffes browsed on acacia canopies. Aurochs, massive wild cattle standing over 6 feet at the shoulder, grazed in groups. Gazelles and hartebeest moved in seasonal migrations, following the rains and the fresh growth they produced. The aquatic ecosystems were equally rich. Nile perch, native to the Nile River basin and to Lake Chad today, spread throughout the interconnected river and lake systems of the Green Sahara. These are ambush predators that hunt smaller fish and can grow to immense sizes in productive waters. The 6-foot specimens found in archaeological middens represent individuals that had access to abundant prey over many years. Tilapia and catfish filled the ecological niches of smaller, more numerous fish species. Clams and freshwater snails colonized the lake bottoms and slow-moving river channels. Hippos were the keystone species. Their presence confirms that the lakes were not seasonal. They were permanent bodies of deep water. Hippos spend their days submerged to avoid overheating and emerge at night to graze on grasses near the shore. A single adult hippo requires roughly 80 to 90 pounds of grass per night. The population necessary to leave the bone density found in some fossil sites would have required thousands of square miles of grassland within a few miles of water. The Green Sahara wasn't a uniform environment. It was a mosaic of habitats ranging from deep lakes to open grasslands to woodland patches, all interconnected by rivers and seasonal wetlands. Rainfall varied by region, with the wettest conditions in the south and west, closer to the Atlantic moisture source, and somewhat drier conditions to the east and north. But even the drier zones received enough rain to support vegetation and permanent water sources. The Sahara had effectively ceased to exist as a desert for thousands of years. People lived along the shores of Lake Megachad and the rivers that fed it. The Gobero site in Niger, discovered in 2000, contains approximately 200 burials, spanning roughly 5,000 years of occupation. The cemetery sits in what is now one of the most inhospitable stretches of the Tenere Desert, but during the African Humid Period, it was prime lakeside real estate. The earliest inhabitants at Gobero were the Kiphians, who occupied the site between roughly 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. They were hunter-gatherer fishers who relied heavily on aquatic resources. Their skeletal remains show them to have been tall, some males stood over 6 feet, and robustly built, with thick bones and pronounced muscle attachment sites, indicating lives of heavy physical labor. The most likely explanation is that they spent significant time pulling rafts, hauling nets, and processing large fish. Their refuse piles contain massive quantities of fish bones, dominated by Nile perch. The size of some of the perch bones indicates fish exceeding 5 feet in length, apex predators in the lake ecosystem, and calorie-dense targets for human fishers. Hippo bones also appear in the Kiphian middens, though whether these represent scavenged carcasses or active hunting is unclear. Killing a hippo is dangerous, but the payoff in meat would have been enormous for a small group. The Kiphians made barbed bone harpoons for spearing fish. These tools are distinctive, carved from long bones and shaped with backward-facing barbs that prevent a speared fish from pulling free. The design is specialized and effective, indicating that fishing wasn't opportunistic, but a primary subsistence strategy. Pottery fragments found in Kiphian contexts feature the wavy line decoration typical of fishing cultures across northern Africa during this period. Then the Kiphians disappear from the record. Around 8,000 years ago, sediment cores show a brief but sharp return to arid conditions. The climate pause lasted only a few centuries, but it was enough to dry the lakes and force populations to abandon the region. The Kiphians either died out or migrated elsewhere, leaving their cemetery behind. When wetter conditions returned around 7,000 years ago, a new population moved into the area. The Tenarians were physically different from the Kiphians, smaller in stature, more lightly built, and less robust. They settled on the same ground, unaware they were burying their dead above the graves of an earlier people who had lived and vanished 1,000 years before. The Tenarians were pastoralists. They brought domesticated cattle with them, descendants of aurochs that had been tamed in the eastern Sahara or the Nile Valley, and then spread westward as the grasslands expanded. Herding didn't replace hunting and fishing entirely. Tenarian sites contained fish bones and wild game remains. But cattle provided a mobile, renewable food source that could be driven to new pastures when local resources declined. Tenarian burial practices were elaborate. One grave contains a woman and 2 children laid facing each other with their hands interlaced, resting on a bed of flowers, identified by preserved pollen in the soil beneath the bodies. These aren't expedient disposals of the dead. They're ritualized acts that suggest emotional bonds and symbolic thought. Tenarian grave goods include jewelry made from hippo ivory, polished stone beads, and carved green stone discs. The presence of decorative items indicates that this was not a subsistence-level society struggling to survive. It was a culture with enough surplus time and resources to invest in non-functional objects. Polished stone axes found in Tenarian contexts were likely ceremonial rather than utilitarian, given their pristine condition and the effort required to produce them. The Tenarians lived at Gobero until roughly 4,500 years ago, when the lakes dried again. This time, the drying didn't reverse. The archaeological record shows gradual abandonment as water sources shrank and the grasslands withered. Where the people went is debatable, but the most likely destination was eastward toward the Nile Valley, following the last remaining rivers as they retreated. The orbital wobble that triggered the African Humid Period didn't stop. It continued its 23,000-year cycle. By 6,000 years ago, Earth's axial tilt had shifted enough that the northern hemisphere no longer pointed toward the sun at perihelion. Summer solar radiation over North Africa began to decline. The change was gradual, a fraction of a percent per century. But climate systems are sensitive to small shifts in energy input, especially when feedback loops are involved. As insolation dropped, the Sahara heated slightly less during summer. The low-pressure zone weakened. The monsoon's inland penetration began to falter, not everywhere at once, but in patches, starting at the northern and eastern margins, where rainfall had always been lower. Plants in those marginal zones withered as seasonal rains failed. Bare ground appeared where grass had grown. The albedo feedback that had amplified the greening now ran in reverse. Exposed sand replaced dark vegetation. The lighter surface reflected more sunlight, reducing surface heating. Cooler ground meant weaker rising air, which meant less intense low pressure, which meant less draw on the Atlantic moisture. The monsoon weakened further and more vegetation died. The feedback accelerated. Water sources dried in sequence. Seasonal streams first, then shallow lakes, then deeper permanent lakes as their inflow rivers ceased to flow. Lake Megachad began to shrink. Shorelines receded, leaving behind the shells of mollusks that had colonized the shallows. As the lake shrank, the localized rainfall it generated through evaporation diminished, speeding the regional drying. The rate of collapse is contested. Some sediment records suggest a gradual transition over several thousand years, with rainfall declining slowly and vegetation retreating in stages. Other records, particularly marine sediment cores that track dust blowing off North Africa into the Atlantic, show sharp increases in dust deposition around 5,500 to 5,000 years ago, suggesting rapid desertification. The dust signal implies that vegetation cover disappeared quickly once the feedback loop reversed, leaving bare soil exposed to wind erosion. The apparent contradiction may reflect regional variation. The southern and western Sahara, closer to the Atlantic moisture source, likely dried more slowly than the northern and eastern regions. Central areas around the largest lakes may have retained water longer than surrounding grasslands, creating refugia where vegetation and animal populations persisted even as the broader landscape turned to desert. These refugia would have been the last places humans could live before being forced to migrate. The debate over speed matters because it determines how much time human populations had to adapt. A slow decline over millennia would allow gradual migration and adjustment of subsistence strategies. A collapse within centuries would force sudden, large-scale displacement with minimal time to prepare. The archaeological record shows abandoned settlements appearing in clusters during the late stages of the drying, suggesting that groups held on as long as possible before leaving en masse when conditions became untenable. Where did they go? The most likely destination was the Nile Valley. The Nile's headwaters in the East African highlands continued to receive monsoon rains even as the Sahara dried, so the river maintained flow year-round. As the Sahara's lakes and rivers vanished, populations would have converged on the one remaining permanent water source in the region. The Nile Valley's population density increased sharply during the period when the Sahara was drying, and some of the cultural markers found in early Egyptian sites, cattle herding, specific pottery styles, symbolic uses of animals, show similarities to Saharan traditions. Whether Saharan refugees directly contributed to the rise of pharaonic Egypt is speculative, but the timing is suggestive. The political consolidation of Upper and Lower Egypt into a unified state around 5,000 years ago coincides roughly with the final drying of the Sahara. The demographic pressure from climate-driven migration into the Nile Valley may have been one factor among many that pushed competing groups towards centralized organization and state formation. The precession cycle continues. Earth's wobble will eventually bring the northern hemisphere back into alignment with perihelion, increasing summer solar radiation over North Africa once again. Based on the orbital mechanics, this should happen in approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years. The monsoon pump will restart, vegetation will darken the land, the feedback loop will engage, and the Sahara will green again. But that assumes the climate system in 10,000 years will resemble the climate system of the past. Anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are adding a forcing that didn't exist during previous greening cycles. The effects of elevated CO2 on the African monsoon are not straightforward. Warming generally increases evaporation, which can intensify monsoon systems by adding more moisture to the atmosphere. But warming also changes atmospheric circulation patterns in ways that are difficult to predict. Current climate models give mixed results on whether the Sahara will green or expand under future warming scenarios. There's a more speculative possibility. Humans might trigger greening artificially. A study published in 2018 modeled the climate effects of covering the Sahara with large-scale solar and wind farms. The solar panels would lower the land's albedo by replacing reflective sand with dark, heat-absorbing surfaces. Wind turbines would increase surface friction, which alters wind patterns and can enhance vertical mixing of the atmosphere. The model suggested that these changes could be enough to restart the monsoon feedback loop, bringing rain to the desert even without orbital forcing. The numbers were striking. The model predicted that sufficient coverage of solar and wind infrastructure could increase Saharan rainfall by several inches per year. Not enough to recreate the full African Humid Period, but enough to allow vegetation to establish in some regions. The greening would then self-amplify through the same albedo feedback that operated in the past. The Kiphians and Tenarians lived through a climate system they didn't control and couldn't predict. Their fates were determined by orbital mechanics operating on timescales far longer than human lifetimes. The green Sahara they inhabited was temporary, a brief window in a cycle that has repeated multiple times over hundreds of thousands of years. We now live in the opposite phase of that cycle, with the Sahara locked in its desert state by the same feedback mechanisms that once made it green. The difference is that we're beginning to understand the mechanisms. The wobble will continue, the monsoon will return, and the desert will bloom again, unless we change the boundary conditions enough to break the cycle entirely.